if you studied ahead, you might have saw that this is a long chapter, and so you might already be prepared for a long Bible lesson. We'll see how long this actually takes. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. We finished up in the 6th chapter, noticing how that the Lord has made His people His own, and that how that we owe Him our service, and He's bought us, we're now His, and also that means that we should refrain from sin, and refrain from being indulging in sins, especially against our body. And fornication is mentioned is prominently in the 6th chapter. So now we go into the 7th chapter with this thought in mind, that we are the Lord's, our body is the Lord's, our body and spirit are God's. It says in verse number 20, and it's our duty to glorify the Lord in both. He says in chapter number 7, verse number 1, now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, we don't know much about the letter that was written to them, but maybe in that letter is where he found out about the sins of the man that took his father's wife and the fornication that was prevalent amongst them. He might have also found out about the discord that existed based on that letter that he received. Maybe he received multiple letters, of folks pointing accusing fingers at other members of the church. We don't know exactly all that went on, but he does know a lot about their problems and their issues, and he can see their immaturity in the Word of God and in the service of God, and their disdain for sanctification, and the idea that they can somehow sin and still indulge in the sin and the pleasures of the flesh and serve the Lord. And so apparently someone has, along with mentioning this fornication that was prominent amongst them, it may be in direct reference to that, or maybe in reference to something similar to that as far as whether or not a man should marry. Here's Paul's response. He says, now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, and what he means by that, and maybe some religions take this, and maybe the Catholics might use it to say, well, this is proof here that a priest ought to be celibate. But if Paul's not talking to priests, he's talking, well, other than the fact that we're all priests before God in the sense that we're part of that royal priesthood, that peculiar people. But since he's writing to the church in general, he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He can't mean that it's better that all men, and required that all men should not get married, because then you would have no families. You'd have no man and wife, no children produced, no families at all. If a man and woman never married, and if men never took unto them women as their wives. But he is saying that it's acceptable. It's not required, but it's acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that if a man wants to abstain and live as a single man, or, and I think this is part of what he's going to refer to as we go through the chapter, a man that's married and his wife dies and he's a widower, or if a man is married. Here's something that we don't think about much, and you'll see this as you go through the chapter. This is the first generation of Christianity. So wherever Paul goes and preaches, and souls are saved, think about it this way. He's preaching to men and women that are married. Maybe one is saved and not the other. See, there's not an allowance made here for a man to, as we go through here, you'll see what I'm talking about, an allowance made for a man to go out and marry, a man who's saved to go out and marry a woman that's unmarried or unsaved. But the fact remains, and it's inevitable, that as multitudes of souls are saved, that families are going to spouses and married couples are going to be saved, sometimes one and not the other. Maybe many times one and not the other. And in that case, if the woman were to leave, then it's okay for the man to remain as he is. And in fact, if we understand this in the strictest sense, Paul's even going to warn that if a woman leaves that is an unbeliever, the man should remain unmarried. And that might be as much as what he's saying here as much as anything else. And that may have been a specific question in one of the letters. That perhaps, what happens if, the man is saved, the woman's not. The man repents and believes, repents of his sins and believes on Jesus Christ, witnesses to his wife. She is upset and leaves. And maybe what Paul is saying here is good for a man not to touch a woman. But I think that's only part of it. I think primarily he's talking about that a man does have the permission. It is acceptable if he remains unmarried, never marries, or remains unmarried after his wife passes away, and he's a widower. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Again, if you apply it to the idea of a saved and unsaved couple, then it's better to keep your spouse with you. Don't chase them away just because they don't agree with you, just because they haven't yet repented and called out to Jesus Christ as their Savior. Keep them with you because that's better than the alternative to send them away, and then you, as the remaining member of the marriage, to be left on your own. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. There should be a care for each other. And again, like I said, I think if you apply it in a physical sense to those that are married to others that do not yet believe, then you still have to show them due benevolence. You have to show love towards them. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. When you're married, then you are one flesh. And your concern for each other should be as if it were your own body. Your concern for each other should be that careful, that we should love one another as our own selves. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. So don't separate yourselves from your spouse with the intent of remaining separate, but unless you have a specific time that you've set apart for fasting and prayer, and then come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. If you stay too long away from your wife, or the wife away from her husband, then their eyes might begin to wander. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. Now there's a couple of ways you can look at this. Paul, in a couple of times in his epistles, mentions something that maybe perhaps hasn't been addressed directly in the writings of other of the apostles or in the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so he might be saying he's speaking this because the Lord has led him to, and this is not something that they had previously heard. But I think in this case, probably what he's saying is that he's saying that, if you go back to the beginning, he said it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He says that it's not a commandment, but that is by permission. If a man seems to be able to do so, he has the permission of Paul, and you might say God's permission, since Paul's writing here with under the inspiration of the Scriptures, that to remain unmarried and to remain single. He says in verse 7, "For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that." This is another passage that gives a hint about Paul's background and his personal life. Some folks think that he's a woman hater, and this is what one of the verses that might prove that. He didn't have much use for the woman as a companion. But I think really what he's saying here is some folks think he was never married, but I think that this kind of proves that he was. But he is not now, because he's proving that he has the ability and the permission of God to remain unmarried, because he wants to be devoted entirely to the ministry of the gospel. I would that all men were even as I myself. Now again, it can't be a general command, because if all men were that way, then again there'd be no husbands and wives. And at least amongst the churches of the Lord Jesus Christ, there'd just be a collection of single men and single women. But he's saying that by permission, if they're able to do this, it would be good for them in their service unto the Lord. Of course, he knows that it's going to be very rare that men are able to do that, or that men are inclined to remain single. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. And the gift that you have to serve the Lord may be just as well fulfilled as a married man as it could be as a single man. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide, even as I. Okay, so he was either unmarried or a widower. He had either never been married or a widower, and you can see that here is what it seems to me. But since it seems like he's had both, it seems to me that he probably is a widower. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So if the inclination is to have a spouse, don't resist that inclination. Don't struggle against it. If that's your desire, if you are inclined to be married, it's better to marry than to burn. It's better to marry than to continually resist that desire to be married and to have a family. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Now he's saying what he said previously. Now again, you could say that I speak this by permission and not of commandment in verse number 6. It might be saying this is what he's saying, but not what they've heard so far in the word of the Lord. Now he's saying, he said, and unto the married I command it, not I, but the Lord. So this does go back to the Lord's teachings. Let not the wife depart from her husband. That's what the Lord said. That's what he preached. That's what he taught. Let not the wife depart from her husband, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So remember, the Lord said that when the twain come together, they are one flesh. So the wife shouldn't, for no reason, depart from her husband, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So the woman shouldn't depart from her husband for no reason. The man should not put away his wife for no reason. And if one does depart, let the other remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Now again, I think that the foundation or the core of this is because there were mixed marriages where some were saved and some where the spouse wasn't. It's better to try to work it out and be a continual witness to your spouse. You'll see that as we go down through here, than to chase them off or do your best to encourage that they would stay. But if they do depart, let them remain unmarried. I don't think that the fact that now this is a big debate amongst Baptists, has been for a long time, but I think this is pretty plain that if the spouse departs, then the other spouse should remain unmarried, or their only option is to be reconciled to her husband. It says here, you can't do that if you go out and get married to someone else. You can't be reconciled to your husband. So this is what the expectation is, I think, for those that are in the church at Corinth, is that they would remain unmarried if their spouse leaves them, even in the cause, I think, and a lot of Baptists don't agree with me on this, even in the cause of even if the cause is that he or she is unsaved and wants to leave, you let them leave, but you remain unmarried, I think is what Paul's saying. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother have a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. To the ones that are able to stay together, Paul encourages that. Let him not put her away. And a woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Stick together if you can, because there's an opportunity that perhaps a soul will be saved. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Now some will use that passage to say that the Lord's guaranteeing salvation for the unbelieving husband or wife, and also even the children. And they think that there's kind of like a promise of salvation in a family sense. I think the Lord is gracious and very often does save families, very often saves couples, and then very often even their children. But that's not what Paul's saying. He's saying that, I think he's saying this from the perspective, remember he says, be ye not unequally yoked together. I think that means you don't go out and marry someone that isn't saved, if you yourself are saved. I think if you understand that even more in a more strict fashion, you ought not marry even outside of the churches. But hear what he's saying: the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. Okay, so they were a married couple. One was saved and the other one wasn't. Your marriage isn't tarnished, but the marriage itself is still right and appropriate, and the unsaved is sanctified by the faith of the other. And he says, else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. You have an opportunity here to witness unto these, and the Lord will still honor this relationship and this family, I think. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Now, people will use this verse to say that a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. They're saying that the marriage can be null and void. And again, I'm in the minority in this, I think, even amongst Baptists. But a lot of Baptists will say that this means the marriage is null and void, and you can, once the spouse leaves, you're free to marry somebody else. But to me, that contradicts what he just said back in verse number 10. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her. Why would he even say that if later on he's going to say you can get married again once your unbelieving spouse leaves? I think all he's saying, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. You're not liable for the support of that wife. You're not liable to keep that family together if the unbelieving spouse leaves. You're not under bondage to retain them or force them to stay, or nor is it I don't know the best way to put this, nor is it a fault of yours if they leave. I think that's what he's saying. They're going to leave, but I think the Lord still expects them to remain unmarried. Because I think the Lord has a use for those that are unmarried and those that are widows and widowers in the Church of Jesus Christ. God has called us to peace. Now, that kind of hints at, again, to me, that what he's talking about is you don't have to force the spouse to stay. You're not under bondage. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Perhaps even after they leave, you can still be a witness or a testimony to them. It's not that we ourselves save them, but we give them the gospel, and we might be the means by which the Lord brings the gospel to them in repentance and faith. But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. Whatever your calling is, that's what we serve the Lord in. Whether married or unmarried, whether married to an unsaved spouse or unbelieving spouse, or whether married to a believing spouse, the Lord has a use for us. Everybody's not used in the same way, and our opportunities aren't all the same. You got this spectrum of positions and such in society, and the Lord calls amongst all of these, and we can serve in that calling. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. So if you're a Jew, don't pretend you're not. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. If you're a Gentile, you don't need to pretend to be a Jew. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. In whatever situation you're in, whatever you're calling, keep the commandments of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Again, that can apply to our position in the family. It could apply to our position in society, or in what nationality we're in. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. So don't be ashamed that you're a servant. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. If you have the opportunity to serve or to live as a free man, then you could almost say that verse 21 is an encouragement for us to improve ourselves, to try to better our position in life. If thou mayest be made free, use it rather. And then he says, for he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. So even though you might be a servant, you're free in the Lord, and you're saved just like the others. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. And those that are called being free are actually, they're servants to Christ. So really, neither is better than the other. If in this life you're a servant, well, you can, when you're saved, you can say, well, I'm free in the Lord. Well, if in this life you're free, when you're saved, you can say, yeah, I'm saved, but I'm the servant of Christ. Ye are bought with a price, be not ye the servants of men. So again, referred back to what we said in the previous chapter, what we read, ye are bought with a price, is the exact same phrase in verse number 20 of the previous chapter. It's a heavy price that was paid. The Lord has purchased us to be His. Be not ye the servants of men. Don't be the servant of sin or sinners. Don't be brought under the bondage of any, as far as in a way that would keep you from serving the Lord. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. So serve the Lord in whatever capacity you're in. Look to God for ways to serve, and no matter what calling you're in. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. Very similar again to what he said back in verse number 6. He doesn't have any commandment of the Lord. Some people say, well, here he is. He's the woman hater, and he's going off on his own, you know. But that's not what he's saying. He says, I have no commandment of the Lord. There isn't any specific teaching of the Lord. He's going to give his judgment, and this is as good as Scripture, because these are the words that come from the Lord. This is inspired. I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful, and also I think based on his experience. So it's worthy for us to hear what he has to say concerning virgins. I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. So you could say that here he's talking about, and I think this could be men or women, it's good for the present distress for a man to remain unmarried, or for a woman to remain unmarried. It's kind of an interesting verse. I think when I read that, the first thing I think of, this is good for the present distress, maybe for the urgency of the gospel. You know, look around you. Look at the souls that are being consumed, and the ones that are dying and going to hell. There's an urgency here for us to share the gospel. And sometimes if we if we have God as our only focus, and not have the family as I don't want to call it a distraction, but we have to focus on the family as well as God when we're married. If we're unmarried, then we have God as our only focus. But some folks think that when he says for the present distress, it might be a hint at the coming persecution. The fact that they're being persecuted by the Jews on one hand, and then the governments of others by the other. For this present distress, it's good if a man's not married. He doesn't have to worry about protecting his wife, or the wife doesn't have to worry about protecting her husband. They can just serve the Lord, and it's easier to move about and do the will of the Lord and flee persecution and distress. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Very similar to what he says in verse 21. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. Then he says in verse number 22, he refers to the one that is called being free. So here he's saying either way you can serve the Lord. Married to a wife, or loosed from a wife. Married or unmarried, we can serve the Lord. And again, it may hint at the fact that the unbelieving wife may leave us. You still can serve the Lord. And you don't have to go around seeking another wife. You can serve the Lord in that condition. And if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. But if you do marry, this is speaking to those that have never been married, I think, referring back to verse 25. And if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. The trouble, I think, is just the affairs of this life, which will prevent us from focusing entirely on the service of the Lord. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none. You know, spouses and family members are just for this life. So it might be a heavy thing for some of these to consider living their lives without a wife, or a woman to consider living her life without a husband. But it's going to be, the time is short. And in the end, Paul says it remains that both they that have wives be as though they had none. And then he goes on to consider other conditions. He says, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not. So they might weep in this life, but it's just for a little while. They might rejoice in this life, but it's just for a little while. Those that buy and possess a lot, but it's just for a little while. These are just things that are mortal and for this life. I was reading the book of Luke. That's my daily reading. And I think the chapter I read today or yesterday, was about the Sadducees that didn't believe in a resurrection, and so they gave this story to the Lord. And the law of Moses said that if a man died, a married man died and left no seed to his wife, that his brother was supposed to take her and as his wife and raise up seed, and any children that would be born would be the seed of his dead brother, so that his possessions wouldn't be taken away from him in this life. And that wasn't the law of Moses. Well, the Sadducees came up with this kind of ludicrous idea that a man married a woman and he died and had no children. So the man's brother married her. He died having no children. There were 7 brothers, and they all married her. None of them had children. So the Sadducees said, well, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Now, if just one of them would have had a son, that would have made it not so, it would have made it, well, you could answer, well, it would be the one that had the son. But since none of them had any children, they're saying, well, whose wife will she be? The Lord said, you're wrong. He said, in the resurrection, they're like the angels in heaven. They don't marry or give in marriage. And that's what Paul's saying. In the resurrection, in the life to come, the spouses that we had here, the family members that we had here, it won't matter. I mean, we'll still, hopefully, by the grace of God, if both are saved, you'll still have communion as the saints of God in heaven. But beyond that, you're not going to be spouses in heaven. And none of these other things will matter either, whether you wept or rejoiced or had a lot of possessions or had none. He said, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. Everything that is mortal is going to pass away. But I would have you without carefulness, he that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. So this goes right back to what he said at the beginning. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. This is what he's talking about. You don't have any cares of this life if you can remain unmarried. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he might please the Lord. And somebody that's married, he says in verse number 33, but he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. And all the things of the world are going to pass away. He just said that in verse 31. The fashion of this world passeth away. So it's better to care for the things of the Lord. But when we're married, we must care for the things of this flesh in regards to our wife. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the vast majority, I think, of the saints of God fall in that category. But again, I think this has something to do with the questions that were asked of the Apostle Paul. There isn't any reason to demean, criticize, or fall out with a saint of God that wants to remain unmarried, because there's many profitable things he can do in the service of the Lord. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin, speaking now of the woman's condition. The unmarried woman cares for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married cares for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So the same conditions exist here. The unmarried woman can focus entirely on the things of the Lord, whereas the married woman has to focus on the things of the world in some measure so that she can please her husband and take care of her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. And this is a difficult verse. I'm not sure what he's saying about what he means about casting a snare upon you, but I think maybe he might mean that he's not saying that you have to be this way as far as being unmarried like him and serving the Lord only, and not having to worry about or be concerned about pleasing a spouse. But he says he is saying these things so that they can coexist with others that might be just like him, and that those that are unmarried might attend upon the Lord without distraction. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. Okay, so he did say back in verse number 34, the unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord. So in some families, the girls, as they grow up, the parents might seek to direct her towards the service of the Lord solely. But Paul says here, if she pass the flower of her age and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. Allow the unmarried to get married. If the desire is present to be married, then it's not a sin. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you want to encourage someone to refrain from marriage, that would be appropriate as well. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So if the two are in harmony, and the will of the daughter is as the will of her parents, there's nothing wrong with that either. And in fact, the Apostle Paul approves of such behavior if the unmarried want to focus entirely on serving the Lord. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. I don't think he's saying one condition is better than the other, but I think he said in a difficult condition or a difficult position that it is appropriate for and it is approved in the sight of the Apostle Paul if the virgin or the unmarried will continue in that condition and serve the Lord. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And this again, to me, is proof that the Apostle Paul isn't encouraging remarriage back in verse number 15, when he says a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, because he says here, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. As long as the husband lives, the woman is bound to her, and she isn't at liberty to be married to whom she isn't at liberty to be married to anyone else until the husband is dead, and then she's at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And that's important because he's telling the folks in the church at Corinth that the widowers, if they do get, or the widows, if they do get remarried, should marry in the Lord. And that's that he's reminding them that they need to marry others that are saved, and I would say also marry those that are in the church. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. So there's about 2 or 3 occasions in this chapter where he kind of hints at the fact that he's teaching things that haven't been taught elsewhere. And he says here, I think also that I have the Spirit of God. So what he's teaching, he believes the Spirit of God is teaching. And he thinks that the widow is happier if she remains in her unmarried condition so that she can focus on serving the Lord. So it's an interesting chapter. It's not much studied, I think, in churches today. And there's several difficulties in there. But I think we're safe. We're safe if we understand that the Lord He places a high value on marriage, but as men and women serve Him, they can serve Him as either married or unmarried. But it's a holy thing to be married, a man and a woman to be married, and the Lord has that marriage is held in high esteem. But we can serve the Lord whether or not we're married. And He encourages those that are single to focus entirely on serving the Lord. All right, now the next chapter, we'll get into what another problem in the Corinthian church, and that is idolatry. And Lord willing, we'll touch on that in the next church service. All right, Brother Ronnie, will you